The forest looks normal until it doesn't. No voices, no footsteps, no movement beyond the trees. Two newlyweds hike deeper along a narrow trail. Backpacks tight, camera hanging from a strap, sunlight fading between branches. Hours later, the trail is empty, their campsite untouched, and the only proof there were ever there's a single photograph taken by a ranger on patrol. In the image, they stand side by side in a clearing, smiling toward the lens, with dense woods filling the frame behind them. No message, no calls, no footprints leading out. Just one last picture, and nothing after it. The forest had never felt so still, so empty. There's something unervingly peaceful about an empty space, a haunting emptiness that grows in the silence of the unknown. The wind barely moves the trees. Their limbs stand frozen, like sentinels in the dark. And in the midst of this isolation, a question lingers in the air, whispered and unspoken. What if the last image you ever saw of someone was the last time anyone would ever see them again? It's a thought that chills the spine, a realization that strikes harder than the initial shock of loss. The idea that something as simple as a moment, a single click of the camera, can capture the final trace of someone's presence in this world. That image, that final glimpse, becomes a cruel reminder of what has been lost forever, without warning or explanation. The question isn't just unsettling in its contemplation. It's unsettling because it hints at something far more sinister. What does it mean when someone vanishes, leaving only a trace, a sign, a clue in the form of a photograph? Does it offer comfort, or is it a curse, a reminder that there is no closure, no resolution? There are some disappearances that don't just leave a physical void. They leave a question, an eternal riddle that no one, no matter how hard they try, can solve. In 2004, the disappearance of newlywed couple Emily and Jack was one such case. On a hiking trip in the remote corners of the national forest, they vanished without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of foul play, no clear sign of why they disappeared, and no answers for their families, friends, or the authorities. For weeks, a team of searchers combed the dense forest, finding only what seemed like fleeting hints, like whispers from the past, of where they might have gone, but nothing that had confirmed their fate. The only tangible clue, the only piece of their final moments left for anyone to find, was a photograph. A simple photograph taken by a forest ranger during a routine patrol. In the image, Emily and Jack stood together, smiling, framed by the vast beauty of the wilderness. But their smiles, when looked at with the benefit of hindsight, held something that no one noticed at the time. Something not quite right. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't joy either. It was something between the two, an unsettling tension, as though they were standing on the edge of something they couldn't understand, something they couldn't escape. And this photograph, this innocuous moment frozen in time, would become the central mystery in their disappearance, a symbol of the eerie uncertainty that hung over everything that followed. It would lead investigators down a path that would ultimately reveal as much about the human mind as it would about the forest itself. But how did it all start? How did a young, happy couple, freshly married and full of hope, find themselves at the mercy of a wilderness so deep and isolating that even the strongest and most experienced of adventurers could lose themselves in its unforgiving vastness? How did they end up in a place where the only memory left behind was a photograph that would haunt those who saw it for years to come? Emily and Jack were more than just newlyweds. They were best friends, partners in every sense of the word. Their love story was one of simplicity. Two people who understood each other in ways that went beyond words. They both shared a passion for nature, for the outdoors, and for the kind of adventure that was spontaneous, unpredictable, and life-affirming. Their relationship was defined by moments like these: shared hikes, trips to far-off places, spontaneous road trips to unknown destinations. They found comfort in the quietude of nature, in its stillness, its unpredictability, and its beauty. It was something they both cherished deeply. When they married, it wasn't with extravagant celebrations or a lavish wedding. Instead, it was a small ceremony, intimate and close-knit, with only a few family members and friends present. It was all about the connection between them, the vows they made to each other, the promise of a life filled with love and adventure, the kind of life they had always imagined. There was no grand spectacle. Their joy was in the simplicity of being together, in the moments that no one else could ever truly understand but them. But their marriage, like everything in life, was not meant to last in the way they imagined. Not because of any falling out, not because of anything that happened between them, but because of something larger, something far beyond their control. The wilderness that they loved, that they had always found so comforting, would become the stage for their most haunting chapter. And it would start with a decision to take a hiking trip. It was supposed to be just another adventure, another moment in their lives that they could laugh about years down the road. They had chosen to explore a remote area of a national park, a place they had never been before. The trail was secluded, winding through thick woods and towering trees, the kind of place where one could escape the noise of the world and simply exist. It wasn't a dangerous trail, not by any means, at least not by anyone's standard. It was just a place to be, to breathe, and to enjoy the quiet of the forest. But there's a difference between visiting a place and truly understanding its nature. When Emily and Jack set out, they had no idea that they were stepping into something much darker than they could have imagined, something that would forever change their fate. As they made their way deeper into the forest, everything seemed normal. They were happy, joking with each other, talking about their plans for the future, pointing out interesting landmarks along the trail. The trees whisper with the breeze, birds chirp high above in the canopy, and the world seemed to slow down with every step they took. It felt like the kind of peace that people only dream of, the kind of peace that fills your lungs and makes you believe, if only for a moment, that everything is right in the world. They didn't realize then how quickly that peace would turn into something else. A vague unease settled in, but it wasn't noticeable at first. There were no ominous sounds, no warning signs, nothing that would have raised any red flags. Yet, as the hours passed and they ventured farther into the wilderness, they began to notice a strange shift. The air grew thicker, heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The trees seemed to grow closer, the path narrower, the shadows darker. It was then that they decided to stop, to rest for a while before continuing. They set up camp near a small clearing, their tent pitched on the edge of the woods. They had no idea that this would be their last peaceful moment together. After they set up their tent, they sat on a fallen log, eating their snacks and talking about how they would spend the next few days exploring even further. They talked about their future, as they always did, about the trips they would take, the places they would go, and the family they would one day have. And then, for reasons unknown, Jack took out his camera. A simple gesture, a familiar one. He snapped a picture of Emily, standing with her back to the sun, her face bathed in the soft golden light that filtered through the trees. She smiled, as she always did when Jack took her picture, but there was something different in her eyes. Something that no one could put into words at the time. A hint of something. But what? And then Jack turned the camera on himself, capturing a moment of both of them standing there, side by side, together in the quiet solitude of the forest. That photograph, that fleeting moment, would become the last image anyone ever had of them, the last proof that they had been there. No one could have known then how important it would be, how it would become a symbol of loss, of mystery, and of fear. Because after that moment, after that photograph, they vanished. Just like that. Emily and Jack were everything that anyone could have hoped for in a couple. There was a kind of purity about their love, something almost timeless that seemed to radiate from the way they looked at each other, the way they moved through the world together. It was a kind of love that wasn't just about chemistry or physical attraction. It was a connection that ran deeper, woven together by shared experiences, mutual respect, and a love for small things that most people overlook. They met in their early 20s, drawn together by a mutual appreciation for the outdoors. Both had grown up in suburban environments, but the monotony of everyday life was something they'd never quite fit into. Emily had always felt out of place in her small town, surrounded by the white picket fences and quiet streets that seemed to demand conformity. She had a quiet, introverted nature that made her more content to disappear into the pages of books or lose herself on long walks through the woods near her home, where the world felt a little more authentic, a little more real. Jack, on the other hand, had always felt like he was meant to roam. He was the kind of person who thrived in the midst of chaos, who sought out adventure not because he had to, but because he couldn't imagine living any other way. His love for nature was more than just a hobby. It was his calling. He had spent years working as a wilderness guide, hiking through remote areas, teaching others how to survive in the wild. His life had always been on the move, constantly searching for the next challenge, the next big thrill. But there was something in Emily's quiet demeanor, her calm presence, that he found magnetic. She was a contrast to everything else in his life. But that contrast was what drew him to her. When they met, it was like the universe had decided they were meant to be together. They bonded over their shared passion for nature and travel. Both of them had felt the weight of being part of a world that seemed too loud, too busy, and too complicated. Together, they found peace and simplicity of being outside, surrounded by nothing but trees, rivers, and the endless horizon. They spent weekends camping, hiking, and exploring the beauty of the natural world, making memories that would define the trajectory of their relationship. As they grew closer, their adventures became more ambitious. They spent nights camping in the mountains, hiking trails that took them to the tops of hills where the world seemed to stretch on forever. The beauty of nature became their shared language. When words weren't enough, they could always rely on the quiet intimacy of a shared sunset, or the sound of a creek rushing through the forest, or the peaceful moments of simply sitting together by the fire. It was during these moments that they talked about their future, plans that seemed so far away yet so inevitable. They dreamed of traveling the world, of starting a family, of creating a life built on shared experiences and mutual respect. It was a kind of life that felt like it had no end, like it could go on forever. So, when they decided to get married, it wasn't just a decision made out of love. It was a decision made out of the belief that they were each other's other half, the person they were always meant to be with. They had found something that transcended the superficialities of life, something that was real and raw and deeply fulfilling. Their wedding was small, a quiet ceremony that reflected the simplicity of their love. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for a big, elaborate celebration. They had what they needed in each other. Their vows were simple, but they were spoken with a depth of feeling that could only come from knowing, beyond any doubt, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Emily wore a simple dress, the kind of gown that would look out of place in a church filled with guests. There was no glitz or glamour, just the quiet beauty of her smile and the way she looked at Jack as she walked down the aisle. Jack, in a simple suit, looked at her as if he had just seen the sun for the first time. The ceremony was small, intimate, attended by close family and friends who understood that this wasn't about the wedding. It was about the bond they shared, the promise they had made to each other. After the wedding, they spent their honeymoon not in a resort or on a beach, but on a hiking trip through the woods. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect. They didn't need the typical trappings of a honeymoon. Luxury and extravagance weren't the things that made them happy. They were happiest when they were together, surrounded by the beauty of nature. The serenity of the forest, the quiet moments they spent alone, were everything they needed. It was during this honeymoon that they decided to explore a part of the forest they had never been to before, a trail that was far less traveled and far more secluded. They didn't think anything of it. To them, the wilderness was a safe haven, a place where they could be themselves without the pressures of the outside world. The idea of danger never crossed their minds. They were experienced hikers. After all, they had been to remote places before and had always come back, always safe. The wilderness had never betrayed them. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, something began to shift. The air grew heavier. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the sounds of forest grew quieter. There was an eerie stillness, a silence that felt too complete, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. They both noticed it but said nothing, unsure of what to make of it. They kept walking, their footsteps the only sound breaking the silence. They set up camp in a small clearing, nestled between a few towering pines. It was the kind of place that felt like it was out of a dream, an untouched corner of the world that seemed to belong to no one but them. They made a fire, cooked their dinner, and settled down for the night. The stars above them were endless, stretching out like a blanket over the world. There was something magical about it, something that made them feel as though they were the only two people in the universe, that time had stopped for them and them alone. As they sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, the world around them seemed to fade away. The quiet of the forest was a balm for their souls. It felt like they could stay there forever, that nothing could ever disturb the peace they had found together. But little did they know, this would be the night everything changed. Jack took out his camera as he often did. He had always been the one to capture their adventures, to freeze their memories in time. He took a few pictures of Emily, laughing and smiling as she stood near the fire, the glow of the flames reflecting off her face. But as he snapped the shot, something shifted in the air. It was subtle, but it was there, a small change in the atmosphere that neither of them could explain. There was a brief moment of hesitation in Emily's eyes, a fleeting look that Jack didn't understand. She smiled anyway, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When Jack turned the camera on himself, Emily posed beside him, their faces framed by the dark forest behind them. It was a simple photograph, two people in love, in the middle of nowhere, looking as if they were meant to be there. But as Jack later looked at the photograph, he would realize that there was something about it that didn't sit right. It wasn't just a picture. It was a moment in time that, in retrospect, would haunt him forever. In the background of the photo, the forest seemed darker than it had been in reality, and Emily's smile seemed almost forced. The image seemed to capture more than just their faces. It seemed to capture something much deeper, something unspoken. The couple never would have guessed that this photograph, this fleeting moment of happiness, would become the final trace of their existence, that in the months and years to come, it would be the only image anyone would have of them. The question lingered. What happened after that moment? How could two people who were so in love, so full of life, disappear without a trace? The photo left more questions than answers and became a symbol of the mystery that surrounded them. But at that time, as they sat by the fire, they had no idea that their lives would soon unravel in a way that no one could have ever predicted. The day began like any other adventure. The sky was a perfect shade of blue, clear and boundless above them. The sun was warm on their faces, the kind of day that made everything feel right in the world. Emily and Jack woke up to the quiet sound of nature, the wind brushing through the branches, birds singing their morning songs, and the gentle rustle of leaves beneath the soft touch of a passing breeze. It was a day made for exploration, made for discovery, and that was exactly what they were going to do. They had set their sights on a trail deep within the heart of the forest, one that was far less traveled than most. It was a hidden part of the park, a place that didn't show up on many maps, a place that spoke to their desire for solitude, away from the prying eyes of the world. They had planned their trip for months, both of them eager to discover what this remote section of the forest had to offer. It wasn't their first time hiking together, nor was it their first time venturing into the wild. They had hiked trails all over the country, remote valleys, mountain ridges, rugged coastlines, but something about this trail seemed to call to them. Perhaps it was a promise of untouched beauty, a place where few had ever set foot. It was the kind of place where they could get lost, not just in the wilderness, but in each other. They could breathe in the silence, surrounded by the living, breathing world of trees and rivers, mountains and skies, and simply be. It was everything they had ever dreamed of. As they packed their bags that morning, the excitement was palpable. They weren't in any rush. They were in no hurry to get to the end of the trail. The goal wasn't to finish, but to experience every moment along the way. Their pack was filled with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a camera, a map, and a sense of adventure that neither of them ever lacked. There was a sense of lightness in the air, the kind of lightness that only comes when you're about to embark on something new, something unknown. And for them, it was a journey into the heart of nature itself. They set off early, with the sun still low in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The path was well marked at first, winding through clusters of trees, crossing streams, and skirting the edges of dense thickets. The ground was soft, damp from the overnight dew, and the scent of pine and earth filled the air. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick carpet of leaves beneath them, and their laughter echoed between the trees as they chatted about everything and nothing. The world seemed to slow down as they walked, and there was a peace in the stillness of the forest that wrapped itself around them like a comforting embrace. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks more massive, their branches intertwined to form a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting them into a cool, shadowy world. The air grew heavier as they made their way further along the trail, and the sounds of the forest seemed to grow more distant, as if the world around them was holding its breath. The light that filtered through the canopy had a soft, greenish hue, and the temperature dropped just enough to make them pull their jackets a little tighter around themselves. But it wasn't cold enough to feel uncomfortable, just cool enough to make them aware of the growing isolation that was taking root. They took a break by a stream that cut across the trail, its waters clear and sparkling as it tumbled over smooth rocks. Emily sat on a nearby log, her feet dangling above the water, while Jack knelt down to refill their water bottles. The air smelled fresh, clean, like the very essence of forest. The sound of the water rushing over the stones was soothing, like a lullaby. It was moments like this that made them both feel most alive. The world stripped down to its simplest elements, the sky above, the earth below, and the water that flowed between. For a while, they simply sat there in silence, taking in the beauty of the moment. Jack pointed out a family of deer in the distance, grazing quietly by the edge of the trees. Emily smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. It was the kind of peace that only nature could provide, the kind of peace that made everything else in the world feel small, irrelevant. They were in their element here, together, with nothing but the trees and the sky to keep them company. In those moments, the outside world felt far away, as if they were in a place where time itself didn't exist. But as they continued, the trail began to change. The ground grew uneven and the path narrowed, winding its way through a dense thicket of underbrush and bramble. The trees, once towering and majestic, began to thin out, replaced by smaller, gnarled branches that twisted toward the sky like broken fingers. The quietness of the forest became more pronounced, and the atmosphere began to shift. It was subtle at first, but was there, an unease, a faint sense of being watched, as if the forest itself had grown more aware of their presence. The sound of birdsong had faded, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves. But even that felt off. There was something about this part of the forest that felt different, unnatural perhaps, or just unfamiliar. Jack seemed to notice it too, though he didn't say anything. His steps had slowed slightly, and Emily noticed how his gaze darted from one shadow corner of the woods to another, as if searching for something he couldn't quite put into words. She didn't mention it at first, brushing it off as just a product of an overactive imagination. After all, they were in the woods. Things were bound to feel strange in a place like this, where the wilderness seemed so vast and untamed. But as they pushed forward, the unease grew, the silence deepened, thickened, until it felt like the air itself had become dense with it. The path had almost completely disappeared beneath their feet, and they were now navigating through a maze of dense foliage and uneven ground. The trees seemed to close in around them, blocking out the light and creating a sense of claustrophobia that neither of them had experienced before. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, though she couldn't say why. It wasn't the cold. There was a strange heat in the air now, thick and oppressive, but it was something deeper, something instinctual, a sense that they were no longer in control of the situation, that they had crossed some invisible boundary into a place where the rules of the world they knew no longer applied. Jack paused, his hand resting on the trunk of a nearby tree. He looked back at Emily, his brow furrowed slightly. "We should probably turn back," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the stillness. "This doesn't feel right." Emily hesitated. The idea of turning back felt like defeat, a retreat into the safety of the known. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She nodded, though, a part of her already starting to wish they had never ventured this far. "Yeah, let's head back." But as they began to retrace their steps, something strange happened. The trail they had followed seemed to have vanished, like it had never existed at all. The trees had shifted, the underbrush had thickened, and the landscape had changed in subtle ways that made it impossible to tell which direction they had come from. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the path, erasing any trace of where they had been. At first, they thought it was just disorientation, a trick of the mind. After all, they had been so caught up in the beauty of the surroundings that it was easy to lose track of time and space. But as they moved further into the thickening woods, the feeling of being lost began to grow. The sense of isolation deepened, and the quiet became deafening. There was no longer any sign of the trail, no markers, no familiar landmarks, just endless trees, their branches twisted and contorted like silent witnesses to something they didn't understand. They stopped again, this time for longer, trying to make sense of their situation. Jack pulled out the map, his brow furrowing as he traced their route. He looked at Emily, his eyes darkening with concern. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. "We should have crossed the creek by now." Emily's heart began to race as a silence stretched between them, the unease now a palpable weight in the air. There was no explanation for it, no rational reason why they couldn't find their way back. And yet, here they were, alone, surrounded by a forest that seemed to be closing in on them with every passing minute. It was as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. But waiting for what? They had been in this forest before, in the woods they had known for years, but this place felt different. It was like it had become its own world, a world that didn't follow the same rules, a world that was ancient and full of secrets that they were never meant to uncover. The fear began sinking then, quiet but insistent, creeping into their minds as they realized that the forest had changed around them. It was no longer a peaceful retreat. It had become something else entirely, something they couldn't understand, something that had its own power over them. And that was when it hit them both. They were no longer in control. They were lost. The first sign that something was wrong came at sunset. By that point, they had been wandering for hours, retracing their steps, hoping to find the trail they had so confidently followed just hours earlier. But now, the world around them seemed unfamiliar. The trees had grown more oppressive, their shadows longer and darker. The light that filtered to the branches was muted, like the day itself had been drained of its color. The silence was thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. But it didn't feel natural. The sounds that normally punctuated the forest, chirping birds, rustling animals, even the wind itself, were now absent, replaced by a heavy, almost unnatural quiet. The air was still, the kind of stillness that made everything feel suspended, like they were trapped in a moment that refused to end. Jack looked at Emily, his face tense, eyes narrowed with concern. "We've got to keep moving," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. His words, normally reassuring, felt hollow now. She could hear in his tone, the doubt creeping into his voice, the unease that had begun to settle in both of them. They had always trusted each other in moments like these, always had a shared understanding of what to do, where to go. But now, it was as if the forest itself was denying them that knowledge. It was as if everything they had ever known about navigation, about finding their way, was suddenly irrelevant. The worst part was the sinking feeling that there was no way out, that they were surrounded by the forest in such a way that no matter how far they walked, they would never escape. It was a feeling of being caught in a web, and every step they took seemed to make the strands tighter, more constricting. They had ventured far enough from the main trail that even the sounds of the distant park rangers, which had once been a source of safety and comfort, were long gone. There was no one to help them now. It was just the two of them, alone in the woods, unsure which way to turn. Emily could feel the panic rising in her chest, a slow, suffocating pressure that squeezed her lungs and made it difficult to breathe. She tried to ignore it, to push it down, but the longer they were in the woods, the harder it became. Jack had always been the more confident one between the two of them. When they first met, his adventurous spirit was something that drew Emily in. The way he could walk into any situation, no matter how unknown, and make it seem like an adventure rather than a threat. He had a kind of ease to him, a natural calm that made everything seem less daunting. But now, as he checked the compass again, staring at it as though the device might suddenly reveal some hidden truth, Emily could see that his confidence had begun to falter. His brow was furrowed, his lips pressed tight together, as if he were trying to force the answers to appear, to will the forest into revealing its secrets. "Emily," Jack said, his voice quieter this time, more subdued, "we need to think. We got to keep our heads. If we stay calm, we'll figure this out." But Emily could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. He wasn't telling her this to reassure her. He was telling it to himself. They both knew that this wasn't just a matter of being lost. There was something else at play here, something that neither of them could explain, but both could feel creeping through the underbrush, closing in from all sides. There was a suffocating presence in the woods now, something unnatural, something that made her skin crawl. Every tree, every rock, every gust of wind seemed to have its own rhythm, its own pulse, as if the forest itself were alive, watching and waiting. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound being the crunch of leaves underfoot, the faintest whisper of their breath, and the occasional rustle of the trees overhead. Emily's mind raced. She tried to keep her focus, tried to concentrate on the path ahead of her, but the deeper they went into the woods, the less certain everything became. It felt as though the forest had no beginning and no end, just an endless stretch of trees, twisting roots and thick, tangled undergrowth that made every step feel heavier than the last. The path seemed to loop back on itself in ways that didn't make sense, like the forest had swallowed the trail, made it disappear into the earth. The light was fading now, the day drawing to a close. The sun, once bright and clear, had slipped behind a veil of thick clouds, casting the forest in a dull gray light. Emily could feel the temperature dropping, the air growing colder with every passing minute. She glanced over at Jack again, but this time he didn't look back at her. He was scanning the trees, the ground, the distant shadows, his eyes sharp, searching for something, anything, that might give them a clue about where they were. But all he found was more of the same. Trees, shadows, the endless stretch of the forest. The night was coming, and with it, the chill of the wilderness. "Jack," Emily said softly, her voice shaking despite her efforts to steady it. "We need to stop. We need to make camp for the night." Jack didn't respond at first. He just kept walking, moving faster now, as if urgency could push the panic back. Emily caught up to him, touching his arm lightly. He stopped then, finally looking at her, and she saw something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. It was a fear she'd been trying to ignore, the fear that had been creeping into both of them without them even realizing it. They were lost, yes, but there was something else in that look, something more primal, something darker. It was a realization that they were no longer just lost. They were being swallowed up by the forest, consumed by it, and they had no idea why. "I know," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "I know, but we need to get back to the trail. We just need to find it." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. There was no trail. There was no way back. They had walked too far, too deep into the woods, and now every direction felt like a dead end. The light was nearly gone now. The shadows had stretched so far across the forest floor that it was impossible to tell where the trees ended and the night began. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and in the heavy silence, the only sound was the distant call of a bird echoing through the trees. Emily shivered, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the eerie stillness that had settled in, the feeling that something was waiting in the dark, just out of sight. Jack started to walk again, this time with more purpose, but there was a sense of urgency to his movements now, as if every step was one closer to something he didn't want to face. Emily followed him, her legs heavy with exhaustion, her mind clouded with confusion. She couldn't remember the last time they had spoken, the last time they had felt the sense of peace they had arrived with. Now, all they had was the unsettling, oppressive quiet of the forest. They continued on, not talking, just walking, until the darkness was complete. The night had fallen, and with it came the realization that they were truly alone, alone in a forest that felt more like a living entity than a place. They had no more energy to argue, no more will to keep moving in the dark. At that moment, Emily realized something that sent a chill down her spine. The forest wasn't just an obstacle. It was something else entirely. It was a maze, a labyrinth with no way out, and they were trapped inside it like rats in a cage. The realization that they had no way of escaping the forest, that they had walked into its depths and would never find their way out, was a sinking weight in her chest. The world outside the trees, the world of civilization, of normality, felt so far away now, like a dream she couldn't reach. They had become part of the wilderness, part of the silence, part of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. And no matter how much they wanted to escape, the forest held them in its grip, and it wasn't about to let them go. The darkness of the forest seemed to press in from all sides, thick and suffocating, as if the night itself had taken on a tangible form. There was no moon to light the way, only the faintest glimmer of starlight filtering through the dense canopy above. The trees towered like ancient sentinels, their branches twisting and intertwining into a vast, impenetrable web that blocked out what little light remained. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and every breath felt like it was drawing the very essence of the wilderness itself. Emily and Jack had stopped walking hours ago. They had no idea how long it had been since the sun had disappeared behind the horizon. No sense of time at all. The only markers now were the chilling hours that seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness that wrapped itself around them, and the silence that hung in the air, so absolute it was deafening. There was no sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a twig, and the muted sound of their own breathing. But even that felt too loud in a world that had gone still, as if every movement, every sound, was being scrutinized by an unseen presence. The idea of resting, of trying to find some semblance of comfort in the harsh wilderness, seemed impossible now. The ground was uneven and cold, covered in a blanket of fallen leaves and tangled roots, and the thought of lying down in the forest felt more like an invitation for danger than a refuge from it. But they couldn't keep walking. The exhaustion in their legs, the weight of their hunger and thirst, and the mental strain of trying to make sense of everything that had happened since they first stepped into this part of the forest had taken its toll. Their bodies ached, and their minds were clouded with fatigue. And yet, despite the heaviness of their situation, there was still that flicker of disbelief in the back of Emily's mind. It was hard to accept that they were lost. It felt unreal, like they had stepped into someone else's nightmare and couldn't wake up. Jack had been quiet for the last few hours, his eyes scanning the trees, the shadows, as if expecting something to appear from the dark. His face was drawn, the exhaustion and worry evident in the lines etched into his skin. He looked older in that moment, wearier than she had ever seen him before, and it was that look, the look of someone who had come to terms with the fact that they were no longer in control, that made Emily's heart sink. She had always relied on Jack's strength, his confidence, his ability to guide them through situations like this. But now, as they sat in the dark, each of them too afraid to speak, she realized that neither of them had any answers. They were in the wilderness, yes, but they were also lost within themselves, unable to comprehend the situation they were trapped in. As the hours wore on, the chill of the night began to creep deeper into their bones. Emily could feel the cold seeping through the layers of her clothing, gnawing at her skin. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from something else. Anxiety, fear, a growing sense that something wasn't right. Something had changed in the forest. Something she couldn't put into words but could feel deep within her. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, become denser, as though it was pulling them deeper into its grip. The quiet was oppressive, like the forest was waiting for them to make a mistake, waiting for them to show weakness. Jack was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, strained, but there was an edge to it that made Emily's heart skip. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his eyes darting to surrounding trees. Emily froze. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her senses went on high alert. The silence had been so complete that any sound, no matter how small, seemed jarring now. But there was nothing. She strained her ears, hoping to hear something, anything that would explain the tension that had suddenly gripped the forest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted toward the dense shadows, and then back to Emily. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I just thought I heard something." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She looked around, her eyes scanning the darkness for any movement, any sign that they weren't alone. The trees loomed around them, their branches like long, reaching fingers that seemed to stretch toward them, their shadows growing longer as the night deepened. The world felt unnaturally still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "I don't hear anything," she said finally, her voice tinged with unease. Jack nodded, but the look on his face told her that he wasn't convinced. He was still staring into the dark, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Maybe it's nothing," he muttered, but even as he said it, Emily could see the doubt in his expression. There was something off about the way the night had fallen, something that didn't sit right. She felt it too, deep in her gut, the sensation that they were not the only ones in the forest. The thought sent a jolt of fear through her. It wasn't that she believed in anything supernatural, but the forest had a way of playing tricks on the mind. The shadows were deeper here, the night darker, and every noise, every rustle of the wind, felt like it was part of something larger, something beyond their comprehension. They had entered a place that didn't belong to them, a place where the rules of the world they knew didn't seem to apply. And now, They were trapped in it, alone and vulnerable. "Jack," Emily said, her voice unsteady, "we need to make a fire. We need some light." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled the small flashlight from his bag, its beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. He flicked it on and off a few times, as though testing it, before finally nodding. "I know. I don't know if it'll help." "Of course it'll help," Emily said, trying to force some confidence into her voice, even though she didn't feel any herself. "We need to make a fire, Jack. We can't just sit here in the dark." Jack hesitated for a moment longer, then finally nodded. He rummaged through his pack, pulling out the dry wood and kindling they had brought with them. It was hard to concentrate, to think clearly with the thick weight of fear hanging in the air, but they had to try. It was their only option. Emily helped him gather the wood, both of them working quickly, but their hands were shaky, their movements hurried. The fire they managed to create was small, just a flicker of light against the consuming darkness. But it was something. It was a lifeline, a tiny spark in a vast, overwhelming void. As the fire grew, the shadows around them seemed to retreat, at least for a moment. The crackling of the flames, the warmth that slowly spread to their chill bodies, brought some comfort, though it was fleeting. The forest still loomed vast and silent, beyond the circle of light. Emily and Jack sat side by side, their backs against a large rock, both of them staring into the fire, their minds racing. The fire didn't feel like enough. It was a small comfort, a temporary distraction from the overwhelming sense of dread that hung over them. They needed more. They needed answers. They needed to know what was happening, why they were trapped here in this endless stretch of forest. But every time they tried to think, to piece together some logical explanation, the answer eluded them. There was no rational explanation for why they were lost, no logical reason for the way the forest had shifted, for the unsettling feeling that had taken root in both of them. Time had no meaning in the woods. The hours stretched out in a way that made it hard to tell whether it was still evening or if the night had already stretched into the early hours of the morning. Emily glanced over at Jack, her heart heavy with worry. He looked as though he had aged years in the last few hours, the strain of their situation wearing on him in ways she hadn't seen before. His hands were clenched around his knees, his jaw set in that determined way she had always admired, but she could see the cracks in his facade. They were both scared, and that fear was growing with every minute they spent in the wilderness. She reached out and touched his arm gently. "We'll get through this," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "We'll find a way out. We just have to stick together." Jack didn't answer immediately, but he gave her a small, tired smile. "I know. I don't know what to do anymore. We've been walking in circles. I can't find the trail. It's like we're trapped in a place that doesn't make sense." And there it was, the truth they had both been dancing around for hours. They weren't just lost. They were lost in a place that didn't make sense, a place where the very rules of reality seemed to bend and twist in ways they couldn't understand. The forest had become something else. It wasn't just trees and animals and dirt. It was a maze, a living entity, something ancient and powerful, something they couldn't control. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the forest floor. Reaching toward them, the fire crackled in the silence, its light casting a weak glow against the darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly around them. The warmth of the flames was a faint comfort, but it did little to calm the rising panic within Emily. The world beyond the flickering light of their small campfire was an abyss, a vast, impenetrable void of shadow and whispering leaves. It was as though the forest itself had become a living thing, something sentient that watched and waited. The crackling of the fire, which had been a source of comfort, only seemed to heighten the tension. Each snap of a twig, each flicker of the flames, felt like a signal, a warning of something they couldn't yet comprehend. Emily sat there, staring at the fire, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted, though by what, she had no idea. The silence, the oppressive stillness. It was as though the forest had become a trap, one that had been set long before they ever entered it. She glanced over at Jack, whose eyes were fixed on the fire, his face a mask of determination. But even in the dim light, she could see the fear in his eyes, the unease that had begun to creep into his every movement. The man who had always been so sure of himself was beginning to doubt, and that realization was more terrifying than anything else. They had been here for hours, lost in the depths of the forest, and yet every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into it. The trees, towering and ancient, loomed around them like silent witnesses, and the path they had once followed had vanished, swallowed by the wilderness. Emily had tried to reassure herself that it was just disorientation, simple confusion in the vastness of the woods. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. There was something more, something that neither of them could explain, but both of them could feel. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the sensation that they were not alone. It was as though the forest itself had begun to close in around them, like an unseen presence that moved just beyond the reach of their senses. The night was heavy with it, thick with something they couldn't put into words, something they had no vocabulary for. The way the trees seemed to move just out of sight, the faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the feeling that every shadow his secret. They were all pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. It was sensation that burrowed deep in Emily's chest, a gnawing discomfort that refused to leave. Jack finally broke the silence, his voice low and strained, as though he were afraid of what might come next. "I keep thinking I'm hearing something," he said, his eyes scanning the trees, his body tense. "But every time I turn around, there's nothing. It's like the forest is playing tricks on me." Emily's stomach tightened. She had felt it too. It wasn't just the sounds. It was the way the shadows seemed to shift in the corner of her vision, how they seemed to take on a life of their own, bending and twisting in ways that defied reason. It was as though the forest itself had become aware of them, as though it was waiting for something. They weren't just lost. They were being observed, hunted, and it was this feeling, this visceral sense of being prey, that made her blood run cold. "I don't know if it's a forest," Emily said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the backdrop of night. "But it's like it's alive, Jack. Like it's watching us." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared into the flames, his jaw clenched tight as though trying to hold on to some semblance of control. She knew he was struggling to stay calm, to think clearly, to find a way out. But the more they stayed in the forest, the more the idea of leaving seemed impossible, as though the forest itself had swallowed them whole, and there was no way out. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The crackling fire was the only sound, and it seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. Emily's mind raced, but the thoughts refused to form into anything coherent. She had never felt so alone, so powerless in her life. They were deep in the woods, with no way of knowing which direction to go, no landmarks to guide them. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming, like they were suspended in a void where the usual rules of the world no longer applied. Suddenly, a noise broke through the stillness, sharp and unmistakable. A snap of a branch, a rustle of leaves. Emily's heart jumped in her chest, and she froze, her eyes wide as she searched the darkness for any sign of movement. Jack was already on his feet, his hand reaching for the small flashlight that was clipped to his backpack. The beam of light flickered to life, cutting through the thick blackness, but it revealed nothing. "It's probably just an animal," Jack said, though his voice lacked the confidence he normally carried. "A deer or something." Emily nodded, though she didn't believe him. It didn't feel like an animal. It felt different. There was something in the way the sound had come to them, something deliberate in the way it had broken the silence. And the worst part was the sensation that followed it, a deep, gnawing feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of their sight, something that wasn't quite right. Jack stepped forward, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but all it revealed was more trees, more shadows. The forest was endless. The trees, unchanging, loomed like silent sentinels. He turned back to Emily, his eyes wide with a kind of terror that he was trying desperately to conceal. "I don't know what's happening, Emily," Jack said, his voice trembling. "I keep thinking I hear something, but there's nothing there. It's like the forest is alive, and it's playing tricks on me. It's not natural." Emily felt her heart rate spike. His words mirrored her own thoughts. The forest was playing tricks on them, wasn't it? But the worst part wasn't the tricks. It was the creeping suspicion that something in the forest was actively trying to keep them there, like a predator toying with its prey. They weren't just lost. They were trapped, and it felt like they were being herded deeper into the woods with every step they took. "Let's keep moving," Emily suggested, though she wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. The fire had given them a false sense of security. But now, the very act of sitting still seemed to invite danger. "We can't stay here. We need to find a way out." Jack didn't argue. He simply nodded and picked up his pack, his eyes darting around them as though the shadows themselves were closing in. They gathered their things quickly, both of them working in tense silence, the unease growing between them like a storm cloud waiting to break. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made their nerves spike. They had been so careful to remain quiet, to keep their movements as subtle as possible, but now it felt as if every action they took was being noticed, tracked. The forest, it seemed, was not just an obstacle. It was an entity, a force that they couldn't understand, let alone escape from. Emily could feel it now, the weight of the forest pressing down on her, making her movements sluggish, her thoughts scattered. She glanced over at Jack, his expression tight, his steps quick but unsteady. He was terrified, but he was hiding it well. She had always admired his strength, his ability to stay calm in a crisis, but now she could see the cracks. The fear was there, lurking just beneath the surface. They moved forward cautiously, the light from Jack's flashlight cutting through the trees, but it seemed to make the shadows more oppressive, more alive. Each step they took felt heavier, more labored. The forest had become a labyrinth, a maze with no way out, and the further they went, the more disoriented they became. The trees had begun to look alike, tall, dark, and ancient, and every turn they took seemed to bring them back to the same place, as though the forest itself was playing a cruel game with them. And then the air shifted. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, and with it came the faintest scent, something old, something damp, and something that made Emily's stomach turn. She stopped, her breath caught in her throat. Jack, sensing the change, turned to look at her. "Do you smell that?" she whispered. Jack nodded slowly, his face pale. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, barely audible. "I don't know what it is, but it's not normal." The wind seemed to stop as suddenly as it had come, and with its disappearance, the silence returned, thick, oppressive, and unnerving. The forest was watching them, and now it felt like the very trees themselves were closing in, pressing them from all sides, keeping them in the center of a trap they couldn't escape. Every breath, every movement, seemed to echo in the vastness around them. There was no sound, no animal calls, no wind rustling the leaves, just the eerie silence, broken only by the beating of their hearts. They kept moving, but Emily could feel it now, in the pit of her stomach, the knowledge that they were not alone, that something else was there with them, hidden in the shadows, watching and waiting. The forest had become a place of the hours felt like days. Each minute that passed seemed to stretch out longer than the one before. Emily could feel her exhaustion weighing on her, a physical ache that settled deep in her muscles, making every step feel like an ordeal. Jack was no better. His movements were slower now, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of the unseen burden they both carried. They had long since abandoned the hope of finding the trail they had once followed. Now, the forest had swallowed any sense of direction, and they were walking in circles, caught in a maze they couldn't escape. The quiet that had once felt comforting had become unbearable. It was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a palpable presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on them from all sides. The trees, ancient and towering, seemed to loom over them like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, brushing against the darkness. The air itself felt heavier, thicker, as if the forest were trying to smother them, drowning them in its silent embrace. It was a stillness that made it impossible to think clearly, to hold on to any sense of rationality. They were lost, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and in every sense of the word. Emily glanced at Jack, but he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the path ahead, but there was no real focus in his gaze. He had the look of a man who was running on fumes, the determination in his face a mask for the fear that had begun to consume him. It was the same fear that had begun to claw at Emily's own insides. She could feel in the way her heart raced whenever the wind shifted or when the shadows moved just a little too unnaturally. It was the kind of fear that didn't have a name, that didn't have a face. It was a primal, visceral fear that told them something was wrong, deeply wrong, and they were powerless to stop it. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made them both jump. They were hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. But there was nothing to explain the noises that seemed to come from all directions, from just beyond the reach of their senses. The forest had become something else, something beyond comprehension. The trees seemed to grow more twisted, more gnarled with each step they took, their bark slick with moisture. The shadows were no longer just the absence of light. They were something darker, something alive, moving with a rhythm that Emily could feel in her bones. She could almost hear the trees whispering to each other, the wind carrying their secrets on its breath, and she wondered if they were mocking her, if they were part of some ancient game she didn't understand. Jack's voice broke through her thoughts, low and strained. "We need to keep moving," he said, though his words seemed to lack the urgency they once had. It was a command, but it was also a plea, a desperate attempt to maintain control, to hold on to the last shred of their shared resolve. "I know," Emily replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. What did moving forward even mean? Every direction seemed the same, endless trees, endless shadows. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going, but the idea of stopping, of sitting down and giving in, was worse than the exhaustion. They couldn't stop. They couldn't give up. Not yet. She didn't want to voice the thought that had been nagging at her for hours, the one that had been growing louder in her mind. What if they were never meant to leave? What if the forest wasn't just an obstacle, but something else entirely? Something older, something more malevolent. It was a thought that made her skin crawl, but it was impossible to ignore. Every step they took felt like they were sinking deeper into a place where the rules of nature no longer applied, where reality itself bent and twisted in ways they couldn't understand. It was as though the forest had become sentient, aware of them, watching them, waiting. They moved on, though the light from a flashlight grew dimmer with each passing minute, the batteries draining faster than either of them could have anticipated. Emily had hoped to preserve the light, but now it felt like the small, flickering beam was more of a curse than a blessing. It illuminated only a small circle of space around them, and the darkness beyond seemed to swallow everything else, pulling them further into its depths. The shadows were everywhere, stretching long and far, twisting in unnatural ways as if they had lives of their own. A distant howl, or perhaps a scream, pierced the silence, making both of them freeze in place. The sound was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was enough to send a shiver down Emily's spine. It wasn't the cry of any animal she had ever heard. It was something else, something human, or at least human-sounding, twisted into a sound of anguish. The forest swallowed it quickly, and the silence returned, but the feeling it left behind lingered in the air, thick with tension. It was a warning, a reminder that they were not alone. The realization hit Emily like a punch to the gut. There were other things in this forest, things that weren't supposed to be here, and they had been here long before her and Jack ever set foot in it. "We need to find shelter," Jack said, his voice shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "We can't stay out here in the open." Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure what good shelter would do at this point. The forest wasn't just a physical place. It had become a labyrinth of the mind. Every turn, every step they took led them deeper into confusion. It was like the trees themselves were conspiring to keep them lost. And as much as she wanted to believe they were just disoriented, just caught in a normal wilderness survival situation, the feeling that something else was at play, the feeling that something was watching them, hunting them, kept gnawing at her. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing instinct that told her that their presence in this forest wasn't just an accident. They had been chosen for something. But what? They stumbled upon a small clearing, though the sense of relief that came with it was fleeting. The moon had finally begun to rise, and the light from above was weak, barely enough to reveal the world around them. The trees had opened up just enough to let them sit, but the air was still thick with the same oppressive silence. The shadows didn't seem to move here, but they hung low and heavy, and the space around them felt claustrophobic, as though the walls of the forest were closing in. Emily didn't know what they were hoping to find in the clearing. Shelter? A way out? A sign that they weren't truly alone? The longer they stayed, the more it felt like the forest itself had taken on a life of its own, like it was waiting for them to make a mistake, waiting for them to break. Jack sank to the ground, his knees giving way beneath him. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He looked at Emily, his eyes filled with a desperation that she couldn't ignore. "Emily," he said, his voice hoarse, "I don't know what's happening. I don't know if we're going to make it out of here." The rawness of his words hit her harder than she expected. It was one thing to be scared, to feel the fear creeping up your spine, but it was something else entirely to hear it in someone else's voice, someone who had always been her rock. The strength she had leaned on for so long was slipping away, unraveling in real time. She could feel the panic rising in her own chest now, tightening her breath, clouding her thoughts. She didn't want to say it out loud, but she was afraid. Afraid of the forest, afraid of what lay ahead, and most of all, afraid of the unknown. The fear had been growing in her ever since they first started walking, and now it had grown into something tangible, something she could almost reach out and touch. "We have to keep going," Emily said, though even she wasn't sure why. Was it hope? Or was it simply a refusal to accept the possibility that they might not make it out? Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. He had no more fight left in him, no more optimism. All that remained was a grim determination to survive, to keep moving, to keep searching for something that would bring an end to the suffocating feeling that had wrapped itself around them. But Emily knew deep down that it wasn't just a forest they were up against. It was a fear inside them, the fear that kept growing, gnawing at their minds, twisting their perceptions until they couldn't tell what was real anymore. They got back on their feet, and together they moved deeper into the forest, though neither of them knew where they were going. The path, if it could even be called that, had long since disappeared, leaving only the dark, tangled underbrush and the towering trees around them. Every step was like a march into the unknown, a journey into a place where logic had no bearing, where the forest itself seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. Emily's heart raced as they moved on, the fear growing inside her with every step, the feeling that something was watching, waiting, pressing down on her. She felt the weight of it, the feeling that whatever was out there in the dark was slowly tightening its grip, preparing to pounce. She could feel Jack's presence beside her. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more it seemed to shift around them. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign, their trunks twisted and gnarled in unnatural shapes, their roots reaching like veins into the earth. The shadows that clung to the edges of their vision seemed to stretch longer, darker, and more deliberate with each passing minute. Emily could feel the air growing colder, an almost unbearable chill that gnawed at her skin, slipping beneath her clothes and into her bones. Every breath she took felt heavier, as though the forest itself was thickening, pressing in from all sides, and no matter how hard she tried to push through it, she couldn't shake the sense that the woods were closing in, becoming smaller, more suffocating. Jack was ahead of her now, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam of light through the thickening dark. His footsteps were quick, determined, but there was no mistaking the way his body tensed with every sound, every subtle shift in the wind. He was moving faster now, and Emily could sense that the growing urgency in his pace was more than just a desire to escape the cold. It was fear that had been simmering beneath the surface for hours, a quiet, gnawing presence that had taken root in both of them. The forest was not just an obstacle now. It was an enemy, something alive, something that watched them from every angle, waited for them to make a mistake.